All right. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko, and I'm fortunate enough to direct the Environmental Change and Security program here. It's a real thrill to see a full house, and apologies to those of you. I think we have a seat for everyone, but I think indicative of the importance of the topic of climate change and security links, both on the research side and the policy and politics side, but also the interest in it. Not sure that the room would have been quite so full a couple years ago. And not sure we would have had as many meetings on it a couple of years ago, to be fair. So it's a real thrill for us to be having this discussion here at the center, where we're trying, as I think many of you know, to bridge the worlds of research and academia and the worlds of policy and practice. In the Wilsonian legacy, as our only president who had a PhD, they thought it fitting, they being Congress in 1968, to set up a living memorial, a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum for these two worlds to come together, to learn from one another, and go forth and hopefully do their various endeavors better. The Environmental Change and Security program, we're going into our 15th year now. Trying to facilitate this discussion specifically on issues of environment, development, health, population, in a broader foreign policy and security policy context. So obviously today's discussion that brings in many of those elements, if not all of those elements, is kind of right in line in what we try to do. We do that with meetings such as these. We do it with publications that are both online and in hard copy, and I hope you will avail yourself of some of those out front, including the new piece that one of our speakers, Clionadh Raleigh, has contributed to. And then find us online, with including a live web audience for today's meeting, and the video of today's session will be archived, as well as the PowerPoints available there. So we urge you to take full advantage of that and some of the other multimedia formats that we're trying to do online with today's discussion. So we have, as the title of this session suggests, perspectives from the U.S. and the EU, and both research and policy. And today's event is really one of those ones that is the benefit of being in Washington, which is that interesting people come to Washington on lots of different business. And if you are, if you've told them enough ahead of time to tell you when they're coming, you can have the benefit of capturing them for a couple of hours to get their insights. And that's really what we're doing and taking advantage of with two of our three speakers. Clionadh Raleigh is a lecturer at the Department of Political Science in Trinity College in Dublin. She and I were just until yesterday up in New York at the International Studies Association convention that she came in and presented some of her work at. And so we asked her to tack on a short trip down here to share her insights with us. We're thrilled that she's contributed to our new issue of our report, looking at some of these connections from a variety of angles. In terms of climate change and armed conflict. Also keen to in some ways, have the Washington community have a chance to talk with her and hear from her. She's done some very interesting work on trying to get a handle on the migration implications of climate change by looking at some natural disaster work, some work that she did for the World Bank. So there are a variety of things that she's doing, and I've kind of very unfairly asked her to try to give you insight into a couple of those with a kind of a painfully short amount of time that won't do justice to her research, but it's a thrill that she'll kick us off today. Nick Mabey is the other person who is not here in Washington on a regular basis, or not working from Washington, that also allows us to take advantage of a trip. Nick, as I think many of you know, is a founder and director of E3G out of the UK. Had a stint in the Prime Minister's Strategy Office, Foreign Commonwealth Office in the UK, critical to bringing these climate and security issues together in government, and now outside government, working both with UK, but also the EU, a variety of other national governments, NGOs, private companies, and such. And so somebody who's talking to a lot of different people on these issues, has written a fair bit about it as well, and we will have links to those various publications on our website as part of the summary of this. but in some ways asked him to do a very different kind of brief than Clionadh will, one that gives us a sense of how things are playing on this topic in the UK. I think as many as you know, whether from the Stern report or Prime Minister Blair and now Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and a variety of people, including his colleague in E3G, John Ashton, the climate advisor in the Commonwealth Office, what's going on in the UK, what's going on in the EU, because as much as sometimes here in the Beltway we may imagine that all kind of interesting things originate and start with us, it's not necessarily always the case, and there's some really interesting things going on with our friends across the Atlantic, and so it's terrific that Nick can bring us up to date on that and suggest some ways forward. And finally, Sharon Burke, who had a much shorter commute across the street, literally. I think many of you know Sharon as somebody who has had stints around town in many of the kind of key places for taking climate security seriously now. The Defense Department, the State Department, up on the Hill, working with people from both parties and across administrations, looking at these issues, particularly on energy and security and climate security, and thrilled to have her come in part to help share some lessons from some really in-depth, really did their homework projects this last year, using simulation and kind of role-playing multi-day games with some real high-end folks on the scientific side, the policy side, the security side, and also get her sense of ways going forward. I'd be kidding myself and kidding all of you if we didn't also understand that she's sitting at a really interesting institute these times. The Center for New American Security is one that that if you're following the appointments page, you'll know that they are populating the new government in some key ways, and so we're keen that the thinking that has been going on at CNAS and that Sharon and her colleagues have been doing are ones that we can expect to see in this administration, and so it's a thrill to have her insights as we go forward as well. So I think I'm going to turn the floor over to Clionadh to kick us off. I'll say, as in many instances here at the Wilson Center, we're very thankful to a number of supporters that make these forums possible, in particular, and of course, as is often the case, USAID and their Office of Population and Reproductive Health that's kind of broad thinking enough to understand that there's a whole range of issues that they need to better understand and that their issues are relevant for as well. So we appreciate their support to make things like this possible. So Clionadh, I'll turn the floor to you.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to speak today about some academic research into conflict patterns, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. But basically, my work is focused on trying to understand the links between ecological change and armed conflict, and recognizing that there's a range of conflict it may exacerbate, and the likelihood of whether or not that might occur. And the paper that I'll speak about most today looks at the likelihood of increased conflict given degradation and some other aspects of climate change. But some work I did for the bank, as Jeff mentioned, is related to whether or not climate change is going to exacerbate migration patterns within developing countries. And I'll talk about the spatial and temporal trends there and the relative weight that climate change plays in the decision to move through people. Some very important underlying themes, I think, that run through the work are that there are certain root causes to basically climate-induced conflict, if we can speak that way. And it's mainly regarded, or rather, my work is mainly focused on how there are political and economic vulnerabilities that, in fact, are much more important or seem much more important to the participants of conflict than the physical vulnerability to climate change. And particularly the lack of access to power amongst certain communities, certain ethnic groups within sub-Saharan Africa, and basically access to resources amongst the most vulnerable population has led to, I would say, people misinterpreting the relationship that ecological change plays in their decision either to participate in conflict or to migrate. And poverty and unequal development come up time and time again, both in my work and I think in many people's work in case studies, as really the main issue that we should be focusing on. And in that way, there's a production of multiple vulnerabilities because of political and economic challenges that these communities face that really set the stage for whether or not physical changes might have adverse effects on their livelihood. So I myself do use quantitative methods in GIS and, of course, some case studies to look into how these factors are at play at different scales. So the paper in particular with Henrik Udolf and Prio focused on a number of things that we expect to increase given climate changes and whether or not those will affect conflict patterns. And we looked particularly at degradation, water pressure, and population pressure. And we had some hypotheses that we were directly testing, mainly that areas with high land degradation are more likely to experience armed conflict the greater the population growth. So it's a scarcity argument, essentially, both absolute and relative scarcity. And because this paper was on the local level, or rather we divided countries into grid cells and then looked at whether or not they experienced high to low degradation, high to low water pressure, high to low population growth, and whether or not they saw conflict at some point after that point. We also looked at, as I said, at water pressure, looking at whether water scarcity and population growth is likely to lead to increases in armed conflict. And of course, population. Population comes up time and again as probably the most important correlate to armed conflict. And so understanding the relationship of growth and density was particularly important. But of course, there was contextual factors we wanted to take into account, not just the physical changes, particularly poverty, and whether the effect of demographic and environmental factors is stronger in poorer areas, or whether or not political instability is in some way exacerbating the effect. Namely that, or rather specifically, that areas with these demographic and environmental pressures are more likely to see conflict during periods of political instability. So in some ways it's an interaction between the two. And what we found, the data we used again was geospatial data. One of the reasons that we're able to do these studies now is that there's been kind of an explosion in geospatial data that allow us to look at very local level patterns. And our results really emphasized that it was poorer and marginal areas that saw conflict with or without any sort of ecological changes occurring, or with or without degradation or water pressure or any scarcity variable, if you will. Very high land degradation and water scarcity were not related to conflict. There was a threshold effect between medium and high levels of degradation. Population density and growth are related to higher conflict risk, which is similar across many studies. And very, very, very importantly, environmental pressures were not more likely to cause conflict in poorer states. And they were not more likely to happen during rather, conflict was not more likely to happen during periods of instability. And what this basically told us was that time and again, the social and political factors and the economic factors are the most important determinants of civil war within developing countries. However, it's possible that ecological changes and climate changes may lead to increases in communal violence, basically violence between ethnic communities. And very recently I've started a project on this where I look at the episodes of communal violence that have been recorded, in this case by Uppsala and Prio. And of the 53 episodes recorded, many more involved issues about access to power than they did about access to resources or some sort of scarcity variable. And so, again, I want to serve as some sort of caution to linking environmental change and conflict together on any scale, given that there really is no evidence for it at the moment. And most importantly, and I would say not terribly unexpectedly, Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya experienced the most communal conflict. And there are various reasons why those countries are experiencing communal conflict that have nothing to do with environmental changes. Or, in fact, the potential that these countries experience communal conflict is in some ways already present without any sort of environmental impact. So, and of course, the groups that do involve themselves in communal conflict are typically groups that have issues relating to the regime at that particular moment. So the main findings on migration and climate, which was, again, I was just looking at whether or not there is evidence to suggest that climate changes, or in this case disasters, ecological disasters, particularly drought and floods, will lead to migration within the least developed countries. And of course, disasters vary considerably in their ability to instigate migration. But very importantly, and I think this is often overlooked within the environmental security literature, individuals and communities have quite a lot of coping mechanisms to deal with difficulty, particularly ecological difficulty. There are a range of coping mechanisms that are practiced by individuals and members, including migration to urban areas, that serve as very important determinants in whether or not people are able to sustain livelihoods on the ground. Labour migration is seen to intensify as a response to chronic environmental hazards such as drought, but I want to be very clear, the migration that we're seeing, even labour or distress migration, is temporary, internal and circular. There's very little to almost no evidence that there will be an increase in international migration, but there is evidence that there will be an increase in internal migration. And again, labour migration is rural to rural, which is much more common than I think most people assume, or rural to urban areas. Distress migration, which occurs after an unexpected disaster or a sudden disaster, the patterns of distress migration tend to be shaped by assets, social networks, and available aid. And so in this way, the assets are related to the coping mechanisms that are formed before the disaster. And of course, the available aid is in some ways contingent on government interest in the area. There's quite a lot of evidence, and this is what my current project is working on, or my current project is, looking at how the political weight of particular ethnic groups to governments in some ways shapes the vulnerabilities that they have to climate change because of the available aid and so on and so forth. Finally, again, migrations are typically internal and short-term and do not at all appear to be related to conflict risk or increased conflict. Here's just a little chart looking at the types of migration you might see given gradual or sudden environmental changes. You'll see here that on the time span and the type of movement, only sudden or gradual changes such as extreme temperatures or sea level rise are expected to, in some potential form, give rise to permanent migration. And here is just a map that I made of the areas where there is going to be greatest population growth, but also greatest potential for drought. We can come back to that if anybody's interested. But I looked quite particularly at government policies that influenced migration patterns. And what we see is that government policies that are simply not climate related seem to have a lot to do with whether or not somebody was able to survive a disaster within their home area or whether or not they had to move. Particularly those that increased resilience, such as developing areas, access to markets, infrastructure, allowing for migration, labour migration before a disaster, all had a very large effect on negating major migration flows after a disaster. And of course, policies that influence labour and distress migration throughout the developing world, this is a very serious issue. Many of the migrants that move to urban areas are in some ways extremely vulnerable, more so than if they stayed in rural areas. Of course, we have some very difficult cases. The worst case scenario is being sea level rise. And I think a somewhat understudied component is compounded disasters, which is where either disasters occur quite quickly within the same area, or there might be cases where there's a war or some sort of other conflict going on at the same time as a disaster. In that case, you do see a rise in instability. So again, to clarify the relationship between migration and conflict, or in this case, migration due to ecological disasters and whether or not they induced conflict, there's no evidence, there is evidence linking increased population pressure and refugees to civil war violence, although I do believe that the civil war violence and the refugee connection is somewhat exaggerated and driven by just a few cases. But as far as population pressure, as I discussed earlier, population pressure is a strong correlate to civil war violence. There's only anecdotal accounts of communal conflict as a result of certain migration patterns, and many of those anecdotal accounts never consider the political climate that these migrants were in. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, that communal conflict is most often caused by political issues or economic issues and not because of changes in the migratory flows. The policies, of course, of both sending and receiving countries influence these dynamics. And again, there are only a few cases where we see refugees, even as a result, or rather there's many cases where refugees come from conflict zones, but whether or not they actually exacerbate the potential or the risk for conflict in receiving states is very limited, and I would say, again, somewhat exaggerated, that relationship. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize that the pre-Rouge migration estimates are incorrect in that they often do not consider whether or not how people incorporate risk into their livelihoods. And what I mean by the previous migration estimates, often we hear about these millions of potential climate migrants, and there is no evidence for that whatsoever. Local development underlies resilience to environmental hazards, and again I want to come back to the notion that the political and the economic vulnerabilities of certain people and certain individuals and communities within the developing world have a much stronger impact on their ability to withstand climate changes than their physical threat, than their physical vulnerability. Again, the political vulnerability of these groups also underlies their conflict risk with or without ecological effects, and repeated disaster compounded with insufficient assets and insufficient assistance is the worst case scenario. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clionadh. As some veterans of meetings here at the Wilson Center will know that this is some research that perhaps casts a different picture than some of the things that we've had here at the discussion, which is, of course, exactly why we want to bring it before this audience and in this forum. I think some very interesting suggestions that we remember, something that we didn't necessarily remember so well in the 90s, the importance of the social, economic, and the political, and the poverty and the intervening variables, and that make this, of course, a really complex mix. Also was kind of keen to try to understand how the natural disasters may serve as a proxy for trying to better understand some of the migration dynamics. Certainly to try to find some empirical work to undergird our understanding of migration, where some of the kind of I would say it's often more than just a million or two that are the phrase, but the kind of 250 million figures for migrants on the move and climate change and such. Try to give ourselves some ranges, shall we say, that are start to be grounded. So we'll turn, and as I mentioned to those of you who may have come in late, this is an apples and oranges panel today, in that we wanted to share some of these research findings. And again, apologies both to Clionadh but also to you, because we didn't give her the time to really show you some of the back end of how she came to this and some of the assumptions. We can get into that in the discussion. But we forced her for the purpose of time to just kind of give you the headlines. And it's the same apology to Nick ahead of time, because we asked him to trim a lot from what he would otherwise share with you. But Nick Mabey is really tracking how these issues, the climate and security issues, are playing in the European context, and we're keen to get his insights as well. So Nick, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. And I think I'm going to focus very much on how I think this the whole climate security issue plays through the issues of the Copenhagen Agreement and transatlantic cooperation. But I think actually the core similarity, and perhaps where we can have some interesting discussion about the use of information here, is the core of what I'm looking at is that the past isn't a great predictor of the future in this game. And my job in government was to look at the whole of the UK's risk systems for at one point on failing states across the whole board and compare them with the US and others. And I think my basic takeaway from that was that our data to understand the drivers of conflict and our models and ways of thinking about them were actually pretty poor. And I've become very sceptical of anybody who can tell me a causation link, especially as all the people in the foreign ministry would say that it's all about stories and history anyway. You need to go back 500 years to work out why there's a war now. So I think we have a lot of humility when looking at straight causation here. And so it's about how do we incorporate these uncertainties into making decisions, because in the end decisions have to be made. You can't just say, we don't know. We have to make a decision. So the core of my discussion is what decisions can we make with our current information, and what areas do we need to strengthen our information in? And for me, it turns out you can actually do quite a lot based on what we're talking about, and security is an important role to play. I'm going to flip through this quite quickly. I'm going to talk about the current consensus, talk about European work, about talking about how we understand climate change and security, and then go through three areas: how climate security will play in the Copenhagen discussions, or might, how it might play through some key geostrategic choices, which will also be part of the administration here, and then I'll actually spend least time on the instability issue, because I know the others were going to do that, so happy to take questions, but I wasn't going to go in depth into that. And then propose some things we might cooperate on this year. It's a big year. There is a consensus out there, and I think the CNA report basically came up with what the security sector essentially thinks about climate security. It's serious, it's a threat multiplier, it will make unstable places less stable, will hurt stable regions a bit, and it's lots of interconnections. And that's taken a few years to get to, and there's lots of evidence and non-evidence for it, but that's basically what people think who are sitting in political departments in foreign ministries. Who thinks it? Interestingly, it's not environmentalists. There's only around 2 environmental groups who work on this. In the UK, it was the Ministry of Defence who first started. They run our Meteorological Institute, and they first started looking at this to justify more aircraft carriers. But basically, a lot of people, including here in the US, Australia, NATO, German planners. We think China and India have done some work, but we haven't managed to see it yet. But people have told us it exists. So if anybody knows it exists, be interested. And then a whole lot of non-governmental organisations. In Europe, it's especially the UK and Germany, with a bit of Denmark, who have been doing the work at the governmental level. Europe, we had climate change in the European Security Strategy in 2003. There was a report from Solana in March with a plan of action. That results in several things, including a communication on the Arctic in November, some case studies in Middle East, Africa and Central Asia, and a roadmap for implementation was put to the European Council, which is the heads of state, in 2008, last year, and was highlighted in a review of our security strategy, which wasn't December 2009, it was December 2008. So it's basically kind of in the middle. This is what the security strategy says. Climate change is a threat multiplier. How surprising that came from somewhere. Exacerbating conflict, but particularly issues around disputes over trade routes, maritime zones, and resources previously inaccessible. Notice the Arctic has focused people's minds quite a lot in climate change. It's not all about instability. These issues about access, change is unstable. Reacting to change is political, and so a lot of these issues you find that really, the Arctic is by far the most important climate security issue in the minds of traditional foreign policy types in Europe. And there's a lot of jockeying of position about who's actually in charge of Arctic policy. It's not very sure it's the European Union, though the European Union would love to be. What are some of the things in the roadmap? You can get all the documents on the European Union site. The EU is well suited for taking forward a climate security agenda. Well, the Commission tends to say that. It's a fundamental challenge and it should be mainstreamed. Well, we like all those things. It has recommendations for action in the regions it's studied. It's been looking at climate security in all its bilateral planners discussions. We've found 20 globally. And ministerial dialogues. There will be a new analysis on the impacts of climate change on energy security, which is a different area. Second round of studies, Afghanistan, South Asia and the Caribbean. Those were chosen because they're places we care about. The first one we chose because they're places which are near, so you have no choice but to care about them, and it doesn't matter how much migration you think there is. If the Italians and Spanish think there's going to be migration, it's political. Again, perception in politics is all, and so it doesn't matter what the data says. If the Spanish and the Italians think that, if the Caucasians think the Bangladeshis will migrate, that's an issue, and that's what they currently think. And so actually understanding how this is playing into geopolitics and perceptions and interests is really interesting. We also realised actually we didn't know much and needed new tools and risk analysis, so that's interesting, and need for early engagement with the US. There we are. So expect to see Europeans on your doorstep. But just because everybody was going to ask this, does it matter what the European Union says? Because for security types, they don't usually talk to the EU, they talk to the UK and others. Traditionally that's true. It happens that two of the big security powers, Germany and the UK, do care about climate security. France is a bit more ambivalent, but then France is not really into the new security agenda across the board. It's quite traditionalist. However, coordination of foreign and security policy is growing a lot, and if the Irish say yes in the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, who knows, then we will get a European foreign minister that won't be called a foreign minister, and we will get an external action service, which is a chance to reinvent diplomacy in the EU and different ways of doing it. We have the battle groups in our humanitarian capacity, 20 European missions, and of course the EU is very powerful in its neighbourhood. and not that powerful further away, but in particular good at long-term structural engagement. And if you think about building resilience at scale, the European Union is a great institution for doing long-term structural change. That's what it's really good at. And what's resilience but building long-term structural change at a political and economic level? So actually, compared to the majority of foreign ministries, even in big powers, the European Union is actually the only one with a track record of structurally reducing the risks of conflict on a consistent, coherent basis. Some successes, some failures, but actually it's the only one that's done it in its neighbourhood that well. So some potential interesting things Europe can do. So that's just the background. Policy implications, well, we all know if we don't do anything, even if we do the most we can, we have to deal with a changing climate till around 2030, 2040. Before the scenarios diverge, and just back to this thing, it's fine talking about what happens at 1 degree, but you're talking about 6 degrees of change. You're talking about a big difference. And I don't think you can project anything from past data from looking at 6 degrees change, which is what we have to act in the next 15 years to avoid. So again, it might be happening post-2050, but the choice to make to solve it is now. And so you have to connect the timescales and the lags in the system. So the past will not be a guide to the future. I mean, we think climate change will change the broad strategic context on many levels, and it won't fit into neat patterns, and I'll go through some of these. It will change strategic interests, alliances, borders, threats, economic relationships, comparative advantages, the nature of international relations and the legitimacy of the UN. And lots of these things will change most if we fail to deal with it, but that is still the highest probability scenario as of today. The world has not solved climate change and is not looking like it's going to solve it in Copenhagen as of today, as a political judgment. Security policy will need to get more preventive and risk-based because climate change just injects a huge bolt of uncertainty into the future, a whole nother level, and actually, more and more of it. And greater investment in forward-looking information systems and preventive stances. A lot of this stuff we said we were going to do anyway to solve conflict prevention. We've been talking about it for 15 years. It was my job in government to make it happen. But it hasn't happened. So, again, yes, it would be nice if we said we just have to make countries resilient, but we're actually not very good at that. So adding another risk on top should make us even more concerned than we were before, let alone just the climate change issues. But then we say, well, what do we need? We need to make decisions about this climate security threat that there's lots of information about. But information is only useful if it allows decisions to be made. Sounds obvious, but it's not always talked about. And decisions do exist in many areas which we need to take. Oh, and I've gone to the end of my presentation, sorry. Don't know how that happened. There we are. It was Jeff trying to...
Yeah, that's right. I got
get me to go really quickly. Okay, there we are. The amount of information and the scale we need to do effective decision making at each level differs, which is good because it means some decisions we need very little information and some decisions we need lots. And it turns out on climate security, these issues of where do you invest to make countries resilient involves most information, pretty much. If you're trying to decide how much flood defence at Diego Garcia base you need to stop your aircraft being flooded, you can pretty much do that on current climate science. Or if you're designing your strategic stance towards China, you can pretty much do it on current climate science without any more information. So different, and it's not obvious which way around this goes. But if we're going to do more in this area, we need to drive the research by what we need for decision making, and that often hasn't happened in the past. Mostly due to the failure of the decision makers asking the questions, to be honest, not the researchers. And the way we split the pyramid of information you need is in these 3 levels: geopolitical, strategic, and operational. And very quickly, geopolitical is all about how it affects your relationships and your interests. Strategic is more this issue about instability and how that affects your various aims in various parts of the world. And operational is how much air conditioning do I need in my tanks. And lots of people are doing work on air conditioning on tanks and uniform redesign. It's all very interesting, but it's not actually that fascinating from this point of view. But it gets the army guys very interested. But the information you need is very different. For geopolitical issues, you need long-term global level information with a bit of regional. But moving forward into the operational strategic, you need much more near-term information and much more detailed information. And this is a kind of, so if you might start at this kind of level, which shows that global rainfall changes, Europe's going to have a lot of dry people around it, and then you move to Africa and you say crop seasons are going to get, a lot of places going to have crop failures all over the place, and you drill down further and you map economic vulnerability at a very micro level, putting levels of economic vulnerability, political vulnerability, and climate vulnerability on top of each other and say, perhaps I should invest in the south part of Ivory Coast. That looks a bit worrying. And then you look at micro data about cattle raids in the Karamoja cluster in Uganda, and we've got virtually none of this data. So actually a lot of the things we talk about conflict data, it's just not, doesn't register this kind of stuff, but it's 300 deaths over a couple of months because of cattle raiding before the next rains. It's very normal, it happens all the time, but we're just starting to see this as we get better information systems. Okay, so that's the background. We need, that's the data. How do we get the data to make some of these decisions? Well, we need to think about what decisions we need to make. What do we need to make around Copenhagen? You might say it's not the issue of climate security. Well, I really think it is. Firstly, the basic viewpoint until a few years ago was climate change, high cost, Stern review, 20% of GDP is outrider, but not an existential threat. Stern now admits his numbers were wrong. They're too low. What does the science tell us? Well, this is the science that used to be. This is the burning embers diagram. It shows red is high risk and white is no risk. Various different things, including the last one is called risks of large-scale discontinuities. That means we lose control of the climate or Greenland melts. And the other ones are quite strong. And that was the last time we did the science, the third assessment report of the IPCC. That was the fourth assessment report. Notice what's happened to the red in terms of temperature on the y-axis. That's the safe position of the European Union. It's 2 degrees from pre-industrial, which we set many years ago before the science was done. Everything's moving into the amber and red now, and if you talk to other scientists, they'd say that it should be red all the way down, and the safe level is something like 1.5 to 1 degrees, which we've missed. The science is moving in the wrong direction. It says we should expect to lose control of the climate system earlier than we think, and we'd have to do a lot more to stay safe. So whether we're going to a 2-degree world or a 7 to 8 degree world is now a matter of real debate and what we need to do to become area. So what would happen if we had a worst case scenario? Currently we don't look at worst case scenarios, we look at aggregate scenarios to 2030 and 2040, a few degrees rise, which of course we can adapt to in places with good governments. We don't adapt to in places with bad governments. It still means we have to limit to that, we have to peak in around 10 years. But if we don't look at the worst case scenario, which is about we fail to do climate policy and the worst of the science at the worst end of the distribution turns out to be the right science, and that's been the truth for the last 20 years of climate science. The most radical science has been true. Combined with other resource pressures, we end up with a situation where you can't guarantee security. You really do have large migrations of billions of people because there really isn't anything to support them on the land, so they have to go to the cities. And if you think that's not going to cause tension, just talk to anybody about the history of Europe during industrialization. We will have a move to a defensive adaptation response which will involve the powerful taking the resources from the poor. The poor will do something about that eventually. And we will have a massive expansion of nuclear globally as people move to clean power. That's just going to happen. That's the worst case scenario. It is not a small probability just because it's the worst case. This is like 9/11. Once you've had 9/11, you don't go around doing counter-terrorism based on car bombs. You look at worst-case scenarios where people are quite imaginative about what they do to you. At the moment, we're doing climate policy as if we can just use car bombs. And that's it. This is not the likely outcome. If you think the likely outcome is an agreement at Copenhagen that keeps us below 2 degrees, you are in a very small minority. So for the security people, I should be looking at scenarios that reflect the reality of the political and environmental and economic place we are in. And honestly, and I think that's the best thing about the security communities, their job is to look at the worst case scenario and make that clear. So what can they do at communication? They can communicate the outcome of not solving climate change to decision makers, that they cannot be sitting there to guarantee a world that looks like a world looks today. There is no security guarantee. They need to be involved in saying, well, what do we need from the Copenhagen Agreement to guarantee climate security? There's lots of words there that don't mean anything yet. But what's the risk management paradigm? What's good enough? How much security do we need to buy? No one knows, and we're just about to go into a major international negotiation. They also should argue for a fallback policy, and the fallback policy is more technology. At the moment, no one's arguing for more technology at Copenhagen. They're assuming we'll get all the policies we know how to do, we'll implement perfectly. And anybody who's worked in government knows that's unlikely to happen. And so that's the area. Security should be there to talk about risk and help us use it properly. And in Europe, we're starting to get there. We've talked about 2 degrees for a long time. But we've also saying Copenhagen should look at the more radical science and should review the science in 2015. And we think there should be a big investment in R&D, quadrupling of energy R&D. Perhaps reasonable. We'll see where it goes. But just there. And what could we do there, therefore, to look at this across the transatlantically? Well, I think we could look at the worst-case scenarios, and we're working with Chatham House on a conference in September, look at a risk management framework around the Copenhagen outcomes, which would be a useful use of assessment staff and various governments, and a joint strategy on technology development. And I'm now going to move faster, Jeff, don't worry. Okay, these are geopolitical threats, lots of issues people talk about, mitigation policy, security, proliferation, managing borders, global resentment. I was talking to the UK Terrorism Office last week. It was quite an interesting discussion about climate change and terrorism. But this is all about policies. I'm going to flip through this. Basically, there's a thing about how do you get the investment we need? Well, we need to realise that you can't achieve energy security by undermining other countries' climate security by burning coal. And if you're the US and China, who have the biggest coal reserves, that's you. You cannot do that, because that is an act of aggression, and that's already been talked about at the Security Council in these terms. But you also cannot achieve agreement on climate security without guaranteeing that people can achieve energy security, and that includes poor people, which is a bit harder. And there is no military solution to delivering climate security. You can't bully China into decarbonising with many guns you have. Probably isn't a military solution to energy security, though one might be configured by somebody. That means that our energy security and climate security people have to talk to each other, and at the moment they don't. Which means the current policies techniques do not actually drive the decisions needed to get out of coal into clean coal or into other forms of energy at the speed needed to deal with climate change, because people are saying we've got to keep the lights on. Or in Europe, it's we've got to not use Russian gas. And that's a critical issue of priorities at the highest level. A nuclear renaissance, people are talking about it. MIT, 400,000 growth in nuclear reactors by 2030, 50% in developing countries. That would be 10% of the necessary mitigation to 2030. 10%. So imagine if you decide to solve half of climate change with nuclear. That's a lot of reactors. What does that mean for proliferation? Because they're mostly going to be in developing countries. They're not going to be in our good old friends. So, again, might be a problem, might not be a problem. Is there a choice to be made there? Transboundary water sharing, that's Africa with the shared water basins. Pretty much every major river is shared in Africa. The predictions of water use in those areas, some climate models say it'll go up, some climate models say it'll go down. If I'm an upstream state, I'll look at the model that says it goes down and start building water storage. That's a pretty provocative act for someone downstream. How do we make water management resilient? Already in the OSCE region, we're looking at all our transboundary water agreements and saying how do they resilient to climate predictions? Again, it's not when it happens, it's the political action in advance of when it happens that's going to cause the tension. So how are the national interests going to be balanced? How do we make sure that the climate issue is dealt with at the same level as economic security, energy security, regional relationships, which is what transboundary water agreements will be fiddling in other people's relationships. And that takes a lot of political capital. Most of the prioritisation is a result of organisational inertia and previous structures, and we have very poor policy mechanisms in any country for resolving this strategically. It's usually done by prime ministers and presidents. So how do we embed these issues into the machinery of government? I think the new NSC structure is very interesting in those grounds. Be interested about how is that going to help make these big things. At the moment, the people who say we can't give clean technology to China because that lowers our economic competitiveness are winning the argument. As opposed to people saying we give them clean technology because we need them to decarbonise to preserve our climate security. That is a very clear decision. Who should win? How do we make that debate work? So at the moment, it's not happening. Nor is it happening on proliferation, nor is it happening on energy security, really. And in Europe, we're doing a bit on China. We're moving a bit forward on working with China on decarbonisation. IPR is a huge issue. We've tried to bring energy security and climate security together, but Russia keeps on getting in the way, I'm afraid, and we've yet to work out how to do it. And we have done this communication on the Arctic policy, which is causing conflict. So slowly, and Russia is the litmus point issue for Europe, which it hasn't gripped yet. And I think there's a lot we could do transatlantically to try and find a way forward on China, on IPR, on proliferation, and all of these issues around transboundary water management and borders. Where do we deal with them? Is it Copenhagen? Is it the Security Council? Where do we talk about these impacts? And the last one, well, I'll stay on this one. Instability, yes, it's all about the politics. I totally agree. Because adaptation to climate change, what we're talking about, people will adapt, but how they adapt will be driven and challenged by borders, property rights and vested interests. And communally controlled resource management, which is what you see in Darfur and other places where some of my friends are currently working, amplify climate change impacts, they don't damp them. So the idea that governments dampen climate change impacts rather than exemplify them is untested. And I think the idea of adaptation policies being politically neutral, so if I give you, UN gives you money to build a dam, is that a politically neutral act? No, it empowers somebody, it disempowers somebody else. So again, how do we manage that all the way through, and how does this affect our... Sorry, it's mine. And I'm just, the basic argument is the main issue is what do we need to know where to invest to deal with this instability issues. And I think there's a lot of areas, including economic modelling of these kind of multiple crises, which I think is really critical. When you get the 2008 food crisis, energy crisis, droughts coming together, looking at much better bottom-up data gathering, much more work that way. Understanding adaptation policies as a driver for conflicts. It's going to come before the climate change. It's going to come the adaptation policies, who gets what. And threat analysis, what is actually at risk from these places. And then just 4 things we might do in 2009 based on this. I think the longer-term instability issues, yes, we can build up an evidence base. They take a bit of time. They're not going to happen tomorrow. But I think the issues around Copenhagen and the issues about strategic geopolitical choices do need to be dealt with now, and the security and foreign policy community does need to have a view on what it wants from this agreement. I think we need to develop a common position on what you need from Copenhagen to preserve climate security. At the moment, that doesn't exist. Secondly, we need to know how to talk about risk management. What's the risks we're facing? How do we hedge risks, including the role of strategic technology development and sharing it with other countries? How do we hedge against China's coal power stations, except by giving them clean coal technology or something else? I don't know. We need to, therefore, agree how we're going to cooperate with China on these issues. That is a strategic security issue. It is not controlled by environmental ministries or climate change negotiators. And I think we should have a first agreement about where we're going to handle some of these climate change issues like migration, transboundary water management. Is it in the climate regime, or are we going to put it into the Security Council or somewhere else? Because at the moment they're just floating around and they're about to cause problems in the way we define some of the regime. So we need to know where we're going to put them and then start some serious work. And there's a bit more of this in my book on delivering climate security. But sorry to have gone on. But
appreciate it. Thank you, Nick. I think you've given us a good sense that, as you and I were discussing before we started, the perhaps old world of these discussions being limited to just folks who do climate and really dig down and just are focusing on climate and coming from that environmental or scientific perspective. You've succeeded in convincing other people that this is a big issue, and now the other people are at the table as well. And you get a sense of the broad set of folks who would be interested and part of the discussion as comes through in Nick's presentation about risk assessment, the security community, the broader foreign policy community, the broader development community, seeing these things as are appropriate and the implications then of broadening the debate, shall we say, and broadening the actors at the table. So thank you very much. Turn the floor over to Sharon.
Thank you. Despite the fact that I spent many formative years at the Pentagon, I do not have PowerPoint. Never got bitten by the bug. Let me just start with a big fat disclaimer. As Jeff pointed out, a good number of the leadership and staff in my organization is already in the Obama administration or is destined for it, but I in no way speak for the Obama administration. I have no special insights into what they're doing or what they will be doing going forward, so I shouldn't be looked at in that light at all. This is just what I think, which is idiosyncratic and weird, so that doesn't tell you anything about the state of mind of Michelle Flournoy. But what I do want to tell you is a little bit about the exercise we did this summer, which Jeff mentioned, and then also a more recent study we did on how the U.S. government is actually structured to work on these issues. Because one of our findings of our program all along has been exactly what you said, Nick, which is that energy security and climate change are handled entirely separately in the U.S. government, and there are a lot of problems with that. So how do you actually fix that fundamental problem? And we had some initial findings, and things have changed, of course. What that's going to mean is still pretty unclear, however. So this summer what we did was, it was a war game, right? A climate change war game. A traditional war game, and it was very interesting because we were bringing together communities of people who don't usually use that kind of instrument or tool. It was very unfamiliar to the people playing in the game. A war game, the way the military uses these games is they'll develop a scenario. Like, say, for example, you have an enemy in the middle of the Middle East. Let's just call it Iran, right? And Iran wants to build nuclear weapons. Iran has elite National Guard, palace guards that are a threat. Iran is sponsoring terrorism that may be a problem for your troops that you have stationed throughout the region. So you develop a war plan, right? For if you were going to have a military engagement with this country, what would you do? Where would you move your forces? What would you attack? What kind of retaliation could you expect? And you'll have two sides. Traditionally, these games are what they call red team, blue team, right? Where your forces are the blue team and you develop your war plan, and you're basically testing it against a scenario that someone develops that's meant to be usually fairly realistic about the way things might actually happen. And then you have the red team, the Iranian military would come in and they'll respond. And they'll play the game with you. And this may sound unrealistic, but they actually can be very useful games, depending on the scenario developer and how well the scenarios are done. There was an article in the paper last week that, as a matter of fact, the Army, I believe it was the War College, did some war games testing a scenario for the invasion of Iraq. And that, as a matter of fact, their findings in the war game are almost exactly what happened, but they were disregarded. They were told, their findings were you need a lot of troops if you're going to go in there. You will see a counterinsurgency. You'll see an insurgency develop. You need to be prepared for that. That's what the findings of their war game were. So these can be good tools if they're used well for analyzing alternate futures. And, at the end of the day, the point of it is the process, right? You're not actually going to go win the war in the game. That's not the point. The point is, what do you learn through the interactions and the pushback from the other side? Where are the weaknesses in your war plan? Where are the strengths? What can you expect? And that's the way that the military has long used tools like this, going back thousands of years, where you were actually moving rocks to see if your positions were going to be in the right places. So we decided to use this tool to apply it to climate change. And we wanted to do this for a couple of reasons. One is, at just the most simplest goal, the simplest goal that we had of all, was to help people in the national security community understand that there are national security implications for climate change. And secondarily, to bring people from other communities, from science, the science community most particularly, in to see how these tools are used and how the military views these kinds of challenges. So we wanted to situate these issues in the national security space, and what better way to do that than to use a national security tool. We also wanted these mix of communities of development groups from non-governmental organizations, people who might be going into government or have been in government, people from the military, all of these different scientists. We wanted them all to play together, and different kinds of scientists. We had people who were public health specialists and people who were climate specialists. We wanted them all to try to play out these scenarios together. Now, we chose to do a very complex future scenario where we brought in 4 negotiators. It's really a negotiations game, not a war game. Nobody went to war. But it sounds better if you say war game, get a better response. And it is the tool. It also helps people understand the nature of the tool. So we brought players from China, India, Europe, and the United States, and they each played on teams defined by that nationality to play a futures scenario, which was 7 years in the future. It was 2015, and we were positing that by then, even though in a scientific sense you can't prove that climate change is happening, that the public understanding of the issues has advanced significantly, and that globally most people understand that what they're seeing in terms of effects is the results of climate change, and that there's global alarm about what's happening. Interestingly enough, when we started developing this scenario, we said that there would be droughts and wildfires, that a major cyclone would hit Bangladesh with millions of casualties or fatalities. And our science partners in this said those things wouldn't all happen in 1 year, even 7 years from now. But then, of course, they all happened in 2008. So the scenario we developed turned out to be pretty accurate, just 15 years sooner than we thought. And then the players all played it out. Now, we did some tricky things, too, where I deliberately put certain people on certain teams. So we had 4 Chinese nationals on the China team, but we also put American players on the China team. And partly because we wanted them to have to think in the Chinese players' shoes. And some of the things that happened with these teams were really interesting. The Americans really fought how a Chinese player might play at this negotiation for probably a full day of the game, and kept looking at their Chinese colleagues and saying, why won't you do this? It makes sense. But from a Chinese perspective, it did not. And all of them, by the end of the game, were unfortunately very good at being Chinese. Now, one of the players on the China team, well, unfortunately probably isn't fair, because the Chinese position was totally rational from a Chinese point of view. It's just that if you want to try to control climate change, it wasn't a helpful position. Welcome to reality. One of the players, the American players we put on the China team, was Todd Stern, who's now, of course, the special envoy for the State Department on climate change, and will probably be the lead negotiator. So this game turned out to be very useful. A number of the people who played are now in positions in the Obama administration where they will actually have to play out some of these scenarios. Every country sort of hewed to what you would expect. So you'll have to pardon me, Nick, but the EU team spent the first 2 hours debating whether they could really be a country. So they started with a profound identity crisis. The Indian team instantly came up with a negotiating strategy that sounded cooperative and brilliant, but was completely impossible to execute. So it was strategically brilliant. The Indian team was playing chess, and everyone else was playing checkers. The Chinese team, there was just, no, we're not going to do anything unless you pay us. And that was the negotiating position going in, and remained the same all the way throughout. And the American team was just keen to lead, only nobody was following. So it was very true to form. Now, of course, we had given them positions going in, too. And one of the things we wanted to test in this game is if there was a profound shift in the American strategy, where the Americans really were prepared to lead the way, on including some significant trade-offs and compromises, would it change the dynamics? And at the end of the day, the answer was not really. All it did was reveal what everyone suspects, which is it really comes down to what China's prepared to do. And that became very clear in the course of the game, that this was more about what China's prepared to do and what we're prepared to do to make it possible. So it was a good learning. The whole thing was a good learning event, and we're posting all of the materials on our website, including all of the scenario development, everything like that. We encourage people to use it for whatever purposes they like, if they would like to develop a game of their own. All of that will be publicly available. But and I'm happy if you have more questions about the conduct of the game and the lessons we learned. But one of the most important lessons we learned was in putting the game together. We had to develop future scenarios about what's likely to be happening in these regions 7 years from now, and found that there's a vast poverty of information, of the kinds of information that you need to make decisions, which was a point that you made repeatedly, Nick, is that what policymakers need in order to obligate large amounts of money and personnel, we don't have that information at all. It's just not available. And so there's a huge disconnect between the producers of information and the consumers of information. And the work that you're doing, there's very little work on that's available, that people who have to make decisions about what we're going to do, what we were looking for example, is if you take Clionadh's, tell me how you say your name correctly. Clionadh? Yeah. Clionadh, that's a lot easier than it looks. If you take Clionadh's 2 worst-case propositions, which is going forward, right, if you do have persistent disasters in areas where you have state weakness and state failure, what's going to happen? So, for example, if you have climate change hitting North Africa profoundly in some states that are very weak, and persistent droughts, persistent famine, persistent other kinds of sudden onset disasters. Are people going to move? How many? And where are they going to go? There's no research on this. We should be able to find this out. There are established paths for refugees, for migrants right now. We should be able to make some projections about climate change and some projections about migrant paths. And while we took the point when we did our research, what you said, which is there's no causative link between climate change and migration, at the same time, we're seeing new patterns develop. So if those patterns continue to shift so that areas with large populations right now become uninhabitable in the future, what happens to those people? Because right now, refugees go home, right? Migrants go home. 98% or something like that go home. Well, what if they can't go home? Where do they go? Usually they stay in their region. Well, what if they can't stay in their region because you're talking about a regional problem? Where do they go? So this was an interesting question, and what we wanted to do was force the players to look at four things, which is how do you cut emissions, which is, of course, very much what today's debate is about, but also what do you do if these worst-case scenarios come and you've got millions of people potentially moving and looking for inhabitable places. What do you do if you have an uptick in extreme weather? Do you have the capacity to respond to natural disasters on that scale? What do you do? What kinds of trade-offs are you willing to make? And then on the larger issue of resource scarcity, if water, arable land, if these things become scarcer, what do you do as a country, and what are some of the trade-offs you're prepared to make? Interestingly enough, the players skewed entirely over to emissions controls. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we are, no matter what, if we're playing 2015, we're still in 2009, 2008 at that point. And that's where the debate is right now. But also, I think it was very hard for them to imagine, if we warned them that you could be seeing, the United States now has about 500,000 refugees a year, I think, or migrants, sorry, not refugees. If you just did a straight line projection, that you could be talking about 7 million. That it was impossible for them to imagine how you would have to actually deal with that. So I think if we were going to do it again, we'd actually give them a crisis situation where something actually happens and they have to respond, because they couldn't put themselves in that time. And also, they're not insoluble problems, right? If you have a part of your country, say in the American Southwest, that goes dry and there's not enough drinking water, you can move people. You can go somewhere else. It's not insoluble. Now, cutting your emissions 80%, by 2050 at the moment is insoluble. So it's understandable too that they gravitated towards the problem, which requires actual economic hardship to solve. And they did not come up with any answers, by the way. As one player at the end was very disappointed, she said, "Well, this was a total failure." We said, "Why?" She goes, "Because we didn't have a breakthrough agreement." Well, we weren't looking for a breakthrough agreement, but in that sense also, I think it was a little predictive of some of the difficulties we're going to see next year. Now, that was the game, and as I said, the fundamental lesson I took away from it, both in the drafting of the game and in the playing of it, is that policymakers don't have the information they need to make decisions. I'm most familiar with the defense community in this. If you consider that procurement for defense, you're usually making your decisions about what you're going to spend money on 20 to 40 years in the future, right? So the systems that we're fielding today in terms of the aircraft that have intelligence, satellites, and reconnaissance capabilities, or the MRAPs, the armored personnel carriers that are in Iraq, those are procurement decisions that were made decades ago. So they're projecting now in the Department of Defense for the world that we're going to have to face 20 to 40 years into the future, and they're putting billions of dollars against those projections. So it's okay to have uncertainty. It's okay to have a risk management framework, but we do need the information about what we know about the projections and what we expect to see in order to put the dollars against the risk. And in general, what we found was that the information we were getting from climate scientists and social scientists wasn't the kind that we can actually procure money against. It should be. It has to be, because we are going to see these changes in that time frame. So It's an interesting question. And then just quickly on the structural issues, in August 2008, John Podesta, who was the Secretary General in our game, by the way, which he played very well, he put out a monograph, well, it wasn't public actually at the time, for the Aspen Strategy Group that proposed that the incoming administration, whoever that might be, set up an Energy Security Council that would be a twin to the National Security Council and that would coordinate energy and climate change policy across the U.S. government. When we did our little study about, okay, so how is it structured right now and what would you need to change, there's a lot of merit to that idea because responsibility for these issues is scattered across the entire government. Almost every agency has some piece of this, and the pieces on climate and energy are entirely different places. So the consequences of your energy policy for climate are being considered by totally separate people who may not know each other, who may not talk, and certainly aren't reconciling their policies, their procurements, all of those things. An Energy Security Council, it was very clear to us that, first of all, Congress is never going to be in the lead on this policy, and that's fine. It's not a lack of political will. They're doing their jobs, right? They're a regional body. They have constituents to represent. In this country, our energy resources are very unevenly distributed. You have about 14 states that produce significant amounts of coal. That representative has to protect his constituency. And you could say, well, yeah, but what about the long-term interests? Of course. But if people are out of jobs and starving to death today, you're going to be a little less worried about 20 years from now. The point, I think that you were making that point as well, is that when you're asking people, and this was true in the game too, to decide whether people should die today or 30 years from now, they're going to choose 30 years from now. So Congress, it's not necessarily their role, but in the executive branch, it's got to come from the White House. You have to have leadership from the top. There's just too many places where we're doing this policy. And we thought an Energy Security Council was a good idea, but only if that entity was clearly in charge, because there are lots of other places in the White House that have a piece of this. So, interestingly enough, what do we have now in the Obama administration? We have an Energy Security Council, sort of. We have Carol Browner, the person of Carol Browner, and her deputy, I believe, or one of the people on her staff is Heather, and I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, but Zitschall, who was the lead advisor on the Obama campaign on these issues. And I think they have one or two other staff people. And she is the Obama advisor for energy and climate change. So there she is in the White House, directly advising the president. And Carol Browner's very effective, very knowledgeable on these issues, and very effective government player. But you also have the NSC saying, no, we're the lead on these issues, and we're going to collaborate with the National Economic Council in the person of Larry Summers, also no shrinking violet. So you now have three very, very effective, very smart, and very experienced Washington hands all taking a lead role on these issues. Then you have Todd Stern, our former representative of China, as the special envoy for climate change. And Todd, also very experienced, very senior person in the lead at the State Department, and of course working for a Secretary of State who's already proven she's going to be a force to be reckoned with on these issues and a lot of other issues. And of course she's had her first climate change discussions with China. That's where we're leading on these discussions. Sorry about that, Nick. And where's the president talking about climate change right now? Canada. So that's how things are shaping out early on. What that's going to mean structurally for this administration and for how policy is made is totally unclear right now. It's fluid. It's taking shape. Who's going to be the lead on deciding what the policy is going to be is not clear yet. But I suspect it will be in the coming months. So I think it would be much more interesting to go to Q&A at this point than for me to drone on.
That's great. No, I really appreciate it, Sharon. Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you, all three of you. Obviously, we have three rich presentations that have some overlaps, but also covering some really different territory, both on the research side and the policy assessment side, and saying different things for different people, different entities, and giving you a flavor of some of the different perspectives, particularly obviously the EU and what Europe is thinking about this, what the United States is thinking about this, but also obviously the role of some very big players in other regions of the world. So lots to talk about. I will remind you that because we're webcasting this, it would be wonderful if you would wait before posing your question to one of my colleagues get to you with a microphone. Let us know who you are, but using the microphone, that way folks online can hear your question. If you are watching online, you can pose a question if you email to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org, and if you do that quickly, then hopefully we can bring that into the discussion as well. Because we have so many people, I will make that plea for concise questions rather than long expositions and comments. So who would like to kick us off? Yes, go to the back first and then come down here to the front.
Hi, thank you very much for those presentations. My name is David Mickle. I'm with the Stimson Center here in Washington, D.C. First, a comment and then a question or a call for responses. First, the comment about the observation that you all made about the need that policymakers have for information. But then at the same time, many of you remarked that past patterns no longer hold, so information derived from history is not necessarily useful. So will the information then take the form of projections? But as we heard about the war game scenario, policymakers don't necessarily believe the projections. So how can we provide them with future-oriented information that they will believe? This sends me to the comment that Nick made about the importance of perceptions, and here's my call for responses or remarks. The one set of perceptions that we didn't hear about, and it's partially a function of this meeting, is about transatlantic U.S.-European work on climate security. But the missing element here is the perceptions and actions of the countries in the developing world, where most of these impacts will actually take place. That we in the developed world tend to think of climate security as something that the developing world will export to us. Their immigrants, their public health issues, their political instability will then have repercussions to us, for us, through migration or the need to intervene in civil conflicts, what have you. But having just coming back from a long trip with policymakers in India, Egypt, Uganda, United Arab Emirates, they don't like this perception at all. They think of it looking through the other end of the telescope. Climate security or climate insecurity is something that we export to them through our emissions that cause climate disasters, extreme weather events, droughts, floods in their countries, and they feel the impacts first. That the migration problems are going to be local for them. India is worried about migrants coming from Bangladesh, not from the European Union. So one of the sets of policymakers that we need to bring in here are those from the developing world. And so my question or call for remarks is, how do we do that? How do we bring in their perceptions?
Perfect. Thank you.
Let me just first respond to your point about that the war game illustrated that policymakers don't believe projections. I apologize if I gave that impression. That's not true. What the problem is that we don't have the kinds of projections that we can actually use as a basis for policies. I mean, policymakers use projections all the time that don't have much basis in fact. For example, how we look at China now as a potential peer competitor down the line, you can't prove that. That projection is just a projection. It's somebody's best guess about what might happen in the future. What we used for the war game were projections developed by Oak Ridge National Laboratory they were IPCC data runs that had never been analyzed at a regional level. So we actually had extraordinarily good projections. Whether or not people believed them, that wasn't the problem. The problem was getting the kinds of information we needed in order to actually make decisions. So they could tell us, for example, it was actually pointed to a bigger problem that I should have said, which was there's a cultural disconnect between scientists and policymakers on these issues. So what our friends at Oak Ridge could tell us was about the delta between precipitation and evaporation, and we said that's great. What does that mean? And what does that mean for here? And they would kind of look at us and talk about scientific uncertainty. We're fine with uncertainty, but we need to know what they think that means. And for them, that's going out on a limb. When you start to say, well, it means there's going to be drought here, they're very uncomfortable about doing that because in their scientific projections, they're not predictive. And once they start telling you the consequences of those kinds of projections, they get very uncomfortable. So that it wasn't that people didn't believe the projections. It was more that it's the wrong kind of information for people to actually make decisions on. And I do think also that we were acutely aware that the developing world, I like the way you put it, that we export climate insecurity to them. And in fact, the follow-on game is focused on Africa. The problem is, at the end of the day, we can argue about the justice and the reparations, and we'll be arguing about that for many, many years, and many more years than there will be any money on the table for it. But at the end of the day, there are going to be effects, and most of these countries lack the resilience to deal with them. Most of these countries lack the response capabilities. So the question is the United States, for example, when it starts having its own impacts at home, when we have parts of the country that are experiencing great difficulties, when we have Hurricane Katrina, which has been extraordinarily expensive and we still haven't recovered from, are we going to be willing to put the resources up to help these societies to whom we've exported climate insecurity? Are we going to be willing to do that? And that was one of the things that we were hoping to get discussion focused on, is that this is going to come home to roost one way or another. And you can either help these societies be more resilient now, or you will deal with the effects later. And, that was one of the points of the game. So it wasn't that people were unaware of that. I think they were acutely aware of it. The question becomes, in the future, what are you prepared to do? And, we hoped that the lesson they walked away with was do something now. We'll hope for that.
I'm just going to respond very quickly as far as projections go. One of the conclusions to the research so far has been that climate change is most likely not a security issue, as I went over, but instead a very serious development issue. And so, of course, development issues do lead to increases in conflict in particular areas of the state. And we've been collecting very, very local level data that's geo-referenced on conflict events. And we can make projections of where we expect to see conflict based on these conflict patterns that have occurred in sub-Saharan Africa. But if we rely on the conflict to tell us where the future conflict is going to be, then we don't consider the fact that we should actually be looking at much more localized development indicators and livelihood insecurity to predict where the conflict should be. Because again, if climate change, of course, is I'd say a security issue, but it's wound through development, or it's through development that it becomes one in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think that the 2 points is that climate information is much better than most other medium to long-term information we use in security planning, by a long chalk, actually. It just means that everything, but the problem is that scientists won't tell stories, and most of the way we talk about the future in security and foreign policy, we make up stories. That's all they are. And there's not a strong culture of checking facts, so the fact that these are very well determined data doesn't really make them more believable for foreign policy people who are never actually that empirical in where they look at world. So that's what I talk about risk management. Risk management is about who is in charge of making meaning out of the scientific. It's not the scientist's job. It's not even academics' jobs. But there's a massive piece of work to be done to turn what they say into meaningful scenarios, input, things to help decision makers. And that the people who do that do not exist yet. It's like a new kind of cadre of people to do that. And it's not just actually in climate and security, it's also things like conflict prevention, because it's actually the combination of forces, the developmental forces, resource scarcity and other issues. But it's a big lacuna in the space. You can carry on pumping out pure science, and God in climate change do we pump out pure science. And a trickle gets through decision makers because no one's there turning it into meaningful information for them. The second part of your question was about developing countries. I think they're in the climate security debate already. China knows that if climate change isn't solved, China will face massive internal instability because of climate change. It knows that, but it also knows it'll face massive internal insecurity from going below 7% growth rates more. So for China's coal power stations, rock, hard place, it's choosing the rock just because it comes before the hard place. But though China's foreign policy, we have a very strong internal understanding of droughts leading to people coming to Beijing with large knives, cutting off the emperor's head. That's a real internal story. In India, it's the opposite. India thinks it's related to any climate change you can put it. Doesn't think the monsoon's going to be affected at all. Talk to Indian scientists. No problem. Bangladesh, on the other hand, thinks that India's emissions are going to be a bit of a problem. So you're seeing their discussion between Bangladesh and the Maldives and India on a regional level is going to turn pretty hot this year. But it doesn't matter. India's built a wall around Bangladesh, so it's safe. So India thinks. I mean, this stuff is real, and because it's perceptions of the future being acted on now. It doesn't, in a sense that those perceptions are what we're going to fight about, whatever the fact base.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay. Go straight across, and we'll just come right down here to these three. Okay. No, go ahead. You, and then hand it right behind you, and then the gentleman here will take those three together.
That's okay. Good.
My name is Heather Jeffen, and thank you. Very, very interesting. It's so overwhelming, the factor involved in it. And we talked about migration and climate changes and so on. According to UN report, every time we have natural or man-made disaster, the impact on what we call social displacement is almost irrevocable. Like once they move and they stay a couple of months away from their job and security, whatever, they became gypsy of the world. It takes forever to put them back. Is there any of your study has addressed this issue?
Okay, and if you could hand it right behind you, and then we'll come right up here and take those three together before we respond. So, yeah, please.
Take the questions together.
Yeah.
My name is Lisa Friedman. I'm with Climate Wire, and I wanted to go back to Bangladesh and India. First of all, though, the war games sounds fascinating, and I'm very eager to find out more. But I was in Bangladesh last year reporting on a number of things, including climate migration, a number of villages throughout. I mean, dozens of interviews in many, many villages in parts of the country. People are saying they're leaving. Yes, internal migration is huge, but also to India. And I want to get a sense from both of you, or maybe all of you, how much of migration between Bangladesh and India do you think is part of the existing migration that happens across this porous border, and how much of it is exacerbated, at this point and in the future by climate change? And also, if you could give us a little bit of history about the fence, the wall. To what extent is this, was this project started with climate change in mind, and if not with climate change in mind, how are those issues playing out together between Bangladesh and India? Thank you.
And if you could just pack it straight up to the front, we'll take this and then because lots of hands, so we want to make sure we get to everybody.
Yeah, Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. Two comments. First one is this: sure, it's good to have a preventive approach than a reactive approach. But if you do that, then you need to risk management. But risk management important is information data. What's kind of information, what's data, and what's their quality. And then is the risk tool and method. And those really going to help your work game too. Okay, so I think important is try get those things construct. And second is this: two countries, three the climate change are the U.S. and China. Both have a huge industrial production and huge use of coal. And you keep saying taking clean technology to China. There's no clean technology, coal technology. So the very important thing, really very urgent, is to have U.S. and China cooperation, and maybe U.S. can join in to really develop the clean coal technology. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you.
I'll start with coal, because coal's my friend.
Okay.
It was actually one of the slides which I skipped over because I was being too long. I totally agree. That we got we spent a lot of time lobbying last year to get the European Union to put 11 billion euros to buy 12 large-scale clean coal demonstration plants. And I can guarantee you that the G8 in Italy this year, we will be putting an awful lot of pressure on the G8 to come up with the next 8, and then hopefully to fund the ones we've started on crop protection with China, Indonesia, South Africa, and anybody else who wants one. Because the road to climate stability goes through clean coal. Whatever you say, I mean, we do a lot of work on renewables, you need to go through there. So yes, I agree, and I think the one thing the G8 could do is really kind of say this technology will be produced by this time, and then we can decide how we're going to pay for it and do it. But it's not going to be a technological oddity; it'll be on the shelf to use. And I think that would get rid of a lot of the kind of despair about the debate. Then we could have a debate about using it and sharing it, not does it exist.
You don't want that US and China joining?
No, we are. That's the point. We've already approached the administration about. With being Europeans, we have to try and get European money first, which is terribly painful, but it sounds as painful as working through the Senate. So I'm not sure what's better, 27 countries or however many senators there are. And just the second one is on the wall fence, no one knows it exists thing between India and Bangladesh. Extensively terrorism, really economic migration. I have asked Indian policymakers, what would you do? Both to do with internal Naxalite terrorism, which is very resource-based, and also Bangladesh. And the best response was, well, it might get a bit bloody, but we've got very good security forces. I mean, it really is very different to China. There's a very strong undercurrent of belief in the robustness and resilience of the Indian governance model, and it will not be put under existential stress, which is very different from China. And I think it's what they say. I'm not putting a value on it, but I think it's very interesting, the difference in the way they both look at this. And that is going to affect their relations with Bangladesh, because essentially it's Bangladesh's problem. They don't think it's going to import to India because they'll quote unquote deal with it.
On the migration questions, yes, of course, the social impact of migration is huge, and what we're seeing is that increased disasters, particularly drought and so forth, leads to increases in poverty and, to be honest, just increases in abject misery for quite a number of people. As a conflict scholar, I can tell you that the most miserable are not necessarily the most likely to revolt. So it involves an awful lot of elite manipulation, which actually comes back to the Bangladesh-Indian case a little bit. But it seems very clear, though, that increased numbers of poor people are likely to be the result, or the short-term result, at least, of climate changes.
One of the nice things about doing a game like this is that you can test whatever you want, right? You're the god in the machine. And a couple of the things that we did had to do with refugees coming over the border into India, and that the northeast part of India is not particularly stable to begin with, and as you said, that it's not so much the drought or a devastating cyclone hitting the coast of Bangladesh that's the problem too. It's where they're being received. And so, we gave India a hell of a problem having a massive amount of refugees coming over the border into some of their more unstable areas, which they chose not to address, no matter how much we pressed. So we made the point that the wall was only so effective and that people had other ways of getting into India. And interestingly enough, we got, in the course of the negotiation, where there was some trading going on about how people were going to help with other people's migration problems, we got a question from, I was on the control team, which means, they're asking you to dictate what actually has been happening. A question from a U.S. player who's actually a European player masquerading as an American, which she didn't seem to like very much, by the way. What's been our migration policy for the past? Because she wanted to be like, well, we want to know our best practices so that we can share them with India in dealing with this new influx of sudden onset disaster refugees. And we said, oh, your best practices have been to build a very large wall between you and Mexico and to pitch people back over and to increase your law enforcement. And apparently she didn't say anything else in the negotiation. So, but the other thing that we tried, sir, is that we pushed very, very hard. I mean, we really put a thumb on the scale to try to force the parties to agree to come up with a mechanism for joint development or joint funding or some way to push the timeline on technology, to make the point that the reductions in emissions that they needed to achieve, and particularly the United States and China, wasn't feasible in the time frame they needed to do it in, and that they needed to invest in technological solutions as well as other kinds of solutions in terms of demand destruction and all that, and they wouldn't do it. Just wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it for IPR reasons. They wouldn't do it because it was speculative. They wouldn't do it because they wanted to put their money in other places. They agreed in principle, but wouldn't actually put anything on the table. So, and again, I think that's the way it's going to be. It's going to be very hard to push that. And on clean coal, I'm personally not all that optimistic about the technology that we're testing now, but all the more reason to field test it so that we know what we don't have, But, I mean, what we were really trying to test is what the United States and China were prepared to do. And we found not much.
Really encouraging stuff. Gentleman in the middle, and Joe, and then back here.
Brian Beery from Europolitics, European Affairs News Daily. Just a question for Sharon. The EU is asking that the US have a position paper ready sort of within about a month or so for Copenhagen, knowing the team getting into place and stuff. How realistic do you think that is?
Okay. Hold on. We'll collect three again, Joe. And then straight to the back, Rachel.
For Mabey and Burke, question: given the need for data in the short, near-term, decadal scale, how much recognition is there that right now we're pushing the high limits or beyond on some of the IPCC projections with regard to emissions, the melting of the ice cap, and the frequency of weather anomalies? Is there recognition that we need to be working toward the worst case scenarios as the baseline rather than the worst case scenario?
And Joe, just tell everybody who you are.
Joe Dudley, Science Applications International Corporation.
Okay, terrific. And Rachel, if we go straight to the very back, gentleman on the back wall.
Hi, I'm Dane Balker from Department of Defense, and Sharon, I really don't understand what you're saying since you have no PowerPoint, so I was hoping you could put one together for me. My question goes to Nick mostly. If we need a preventative security approach, how is that going to affect the U.S. security posture and the force structure? And actually, Sharon can go to that one too. And if we do adopt a preventative stance, what does that mean, and should we unilaterally engage countries of risk? Do
you want to define engaging in this context? A lot of different ways.
Right.
The military
There's
engages.
a lot of different ways you can. I think that would depend on the
well, for starters, kinetic or non-kinetic?
Either one. It depends on what the situation is that we respond to. I mean, you could have a drought which requires HADR assistance, that humanitarian assistance and direct and domestic relief, or you could have an open conflict that requires U.S. force structure, and it depends on the situation and what's going on there. But that's going to affect also the force structure that we need in the future.
Indeed. And part of why this is complicated.
First, on your question about the U.S. position paper within a month, I think there's something like 34 of 1,500 politically appointed officials in place who require Senate confirmation. So that's not there is very little of the Obama team actually in doing business, and the team that is there is very overwhelmed right now, I think, with economic relief and other issues. So on a strictly personnel side of things, it's probably not very realistic. The people that he's put in place on these issues, who again have almost no staff at this point, just on strictly intellectual firepower, are formidable people who I'm certain can come up with something. But it's also not clear yet who's actually in charge on coming up with the negotiating strategy. And I also think that they're going to have to be creative. What is the American position going in? When is the United States likely to get a cap and trade bill? Or, now, of course, the buzzword certainly coming from the conservative side of the fence is net zero gas tax. And how are we going to play that off of a cap and trade bill? There's a lot of outstanding questions. And so a position paper within a month, strictly on the ability of the people he has, I have no doubt that they're capable of doing that, and I've put a lot of thought into it. But do they have the personnel? Are the unanswered questions clear enough? Probably not. So I think that's a lot to ask, depending on how detailed a position paper you really want. If it's a statement of principles, I'm sure they'll have it done. They probably already do. They do. So if it's a detailed position about what exactly we're prepared to put on the table and take away, that's a lot to ask in a month. But as I say, this is a good team. So whichever one of them is in charge. I mean, really, who's with Obama? Who's with the president right now in Canada? General Jones, Larry Summers, and Carol Browner. So, there's some things to be worked out. On the worst case scenario, I think that's an excellent question, and there's two things that I would say about that. First of all, it seems to me that and I'm not a scientist, but from what I hear from my science friends is that in terms of the model projections that we have, that reality is actually outstripping even the most aggressive model projections. So, which suggests to me that what we thought of as worst case scenario has already moved closer to expected case. That really concerns me. And so I think we need to think in terms of worst case, because so far what we've seen is that our worst case is being outstripped. That's one. The other is, I think, again, it's traditional in the military, and I have a feeling you know this better than I do, that we plan for high-risk, low-probability events. After all, in the Cold War, thermonuclear war was low-probability, high-risk event. And we built an entire military around it and procured billions and billions, trillions of dollars so that we could prevent and deal with that one eventuality. So I think in a way it's the job of our national security apparatus, and I would define national security a little more broadly than just a military, a kinetic response. It's our job to think about the worst case scenario, because if it's something that you can't have happen, that's an existential threat, you must plan for it, even if it's a low probability event. So, I do think we have to plan for the worst case scenario for two reasons. And then just quickly on response capabilities, I'm sure you know perfectly well that that there was a requirement in legislation that the quadrennial defense review, which happens, and you'll have to ask this, I used to pastor the students in the class. I'd ask them almost every class, this one poor woman, how often does the quadrennial defense review come out? And she'd say, I don't know. I'm like, it's a trick question. Anyway, it's a very important planning document for the military, for the Pentagon at large, in that the projections and the estimates it makes about what the building's going to need has real planning implications. The QDR, as it's called now, is required to look at climate change and to look at it as a national security challenge. And also, Michelle Flournoy, the present Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, has in the past been an advocate for a unified national security budget and a unified national security plan, meaning that define national security more broadly and the instruments of power more broadly and how you actually achieve security more broadly, and that you should have a plan for all of those things. So response capabilities, I think that there will be implications for both kinetic and non-kinetic response across a whole range of considerations. And we just finished a study actually for the Navy on what it's going to mean for them within the next 30 years in terms of what kinds of capabilities they may or may not need. Hopefully we'll be able to publish that soon. But I think that there's definitely, in both areas, there are implications for our whole national security apparatus, not necessarily just for the military, although there are certainly some implications for them as well.
Okay.
I think that last question was also particularly directed at you.
Nick, you want to respond?
No, you've got to talk about kinetic responses. I love military speak. I'm just going to go back. Just the worst case. It's actually slowly becoming quite. You kind of realise in European circles that the science, they kind of we're on the edge of the science, and the science is moving. And if the European Council will come up with a response to the Commission's communication on the Copenhagen position in the middle of March, and already the language on that, the current drafts we've seen, talks about taking into account post-IPCC science and projections. So basically moving the baseline from the IPCC baseline to what we found out since then and what the world has done. It's luckily had a little economic recession, which gives us a couple of years, or more, depending on what happens, more time. But then beyond that, looking at the next IPCC review, because I'd say a lot of decision makers worry that we're going to go into a place where it looks like the problem's not solvable. And I think this is when I talk about we need to find a common way of talking about managing climate security and working out what Copenhagen's for. One of the real problems is we say Copenhagen has to achieve this, or we're in the can't control it scenario, which is, and we don't get Copenhagen to do this. And then people go, who don't want to do anything, go, well, that's it then, no point. We'll just adapt. We'll put up the barriers and the walls and we'll keep those poor people out and deal with. And that is a real, we've got to find a way of talking about this. That is a proper risk management. We understand what's on the table, and we haven't got it. If you think people have got it, you're joking. It's just a bunch of scientists' graphs, and then a bunch of people talking about it, and the bit in the middle, which is a considered view on what it means for different policy and how we frame the objectives and our response, isn't there. And I think that is the most fundamental place where security people who think about this a lot more than environment people need to get involved, because they've got the tools and the approaches and ways to do it. And I think that would be a place where the EU, or if we can't get the EU, the UK and the US can talk about it. It's always easier. And I think that comes into this issue of preventative security approach. You need to know where you're preventing. You need to have information to see where you need to build resilience. Or to realise by looking at it, you're never going to build resilience in the Sahel. In fact, the Sahel, you may as well just abandon it. So for you, it becomes a problem. It becomes Somalia. Let's do containment of ungoverned spaces. Because today, no government who's got a budget is going to keep order, Northwest Frontier style. You just pull away from these places. The places are hit first are marginal ecologically, ergo mostly marginal economically. We're not talking about sea level rise, we're talking about variations in rainfall. They are probably got the most marginal people because they're in the most marginal place, not a coincidence. And their people are probably exploited because they're marginal by somebody else who will then take what's left. Who's going to police that? You leave it to someone else to police. That creates problems. It creates problems, and I think mostly on the counter-terrorism extremism side, as well as on the straight conflict for the poor people there. But to be honest, we don't actually care about that. But to deal with it, I care about it, but I'm talking about the kind of security. This was my job, and I had to work out what we really did care about.
What
it's
we
not
spend
Congo.
Money on.
It's a Congo thing. But what would we have to do if we wanted to intervene in those spaces? Get involved in really messy resource politics, which requires not sending development people in, but sending diplomats in with a bit of clout to say, actually, you're going to have to give the poor people more water. Set up a system that allows sharing. And this is the dirtiest politics of all, is regional resource management. Look at the southwest of the US. I mean, honestly, this is tough stuff to do. It is not huggy-feely stuff. And I think we shied away, the development community has shied away from dealing with the fact this is politics. And if you want to intervene politically, you will have to spend political capital to get the right to do that. Otherwise, you may as well just give up and realise you've given up on this space. And people are loath to do that, but it's just reality.
I think Somalia is a good example, too, of the ways in which the military is going to be responding to failed and failing states, which is, it is a military mission, right? It's not just anti-piracy missions, which require some of our largest and most expensive assets off the coast in the Gulf of Aden. It's also, we've been conducting military missions in the interior of Somalia for years now, bombing al-Qaeda positions in the country because it's very hospitable to them. That's the kind of thing, I think, as far as a traditional military mission that you could expect to see in failed states.
I do want to mention very quickly, though, as these unstable states become more unstable, you could say, and these marginal areas that you speak about, as developing governments have to deal with adaptation and resilience, they more than likely, and this has been the case in the last few years, will still choose a group to benefit, and many others then their margin for disaster becomes even narrower. And so it's those politics that I think are extremely, extremely important to sort out as quickly as possible.
It's the adaptation has been talked about as this lovely technical thing the Swedish government does, but Sweden doesn't have much of an adaptation problem. And this is real adaptation politics, and this links back to, if we're going to put a lot of money for adaptation on the table in Copenhagen, which we are likely to do, how is that going to be spent so it doesn't increase the probability of conflict and actually meets them? Because we won't get the mandate to give that money, which is the most morally justified money on the table, and will be there. We have to put it on there to get the agreement.
Nick, do you really think anybody's going to be putting a lot of money on the table?
It depends which treasury you talk to on which day. I think there will be money on the table because, in the end, it's not that much money compared to what we're trying to get to. Whether it's enough and who it goes to. Easier to give money to Africa for adaptation than money to China for coal power stations, put it like that. So, and that's one of the issues. We talk to the most vulnerable countries. What do you want? When would you walk out? When will Africa walk out of an agreement in Copenhagen? When it doesn't get enough adaptation money, or when it doesn't see an agreement between US and China on reducing emissions? And that's a real, for them, that's where's their interest.
I think it's also very important, though, to realize you can have adaptation money, but giving that money to, for example, Bozizé in Central African Republic is not going to mean that much, given that he can't really go into main areas of his state. Or in Somalia, who would you give? Who's the reigning government at the moment? Or even in the case of Uganda, the region that you showed from Meyer and Bond has been generally peripheral in every sense of the word since independence. So I would say that the areas that are marginal now, as you said, will become increasingly marginal.
Okay, terrific. Why don't we take some more questions? There's one in the alcove back there, kind of dark, so I can't necessarily see it. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm Carl Lundgren from Jonah Speaks. I would like to ask an economic question. I have not heard any discussion, or maybe it was very extremely little discussion, of whether we should be putting taxes on carbon emissions, or perhaps a cap and trade system, because we're talking about an extremely serious global problem. And from an economic perspective, if you seriously want to solve it, you need to do either the one or the other, or perhaps both in some kind of combination. And I was wondering how this Copenhagen, whatever it is going to be discussing it, some choices to make here.
Other ones to add? I think what you may be hearing is that so much, if not all, of the conversation is about in the kind of scientific economic interface that we're trying to provide additional framework. Yes, sir.
Hi, Stephen Dahl from Oxford University. I'm curious what you think are the biggest barriers to actually acting on the insights that you generate through these scenarios, as opposed to just meandering along the business as usual path.
Okay, yes, bureaucratic challenges. Okay, should we take those two, because we really are approaching our end time. Anybody want to?
I mean, I think everybody in this field recognizes that you have to put a price on carbon because the externalities are not being incorporated into the price, and that until you can do that, it'll be very difficult to move. However, for reasons that I mentioned, it's going to be a challenge in the United States. This is not an issue that falls evenly across our country. It's been masquerading as a partisan issue for the last several years. I believe it'll be clear that's not really the case. It's a regional issue. So that fight hasn't really been had yet because we've been distracted by the fact that Republicans and Democrats see it differently. And so I think that we've got an internal working out to do. And what I hope we see is a bill put forward that redistributes, that helps with where these places are going to have pain inflicted on them. Because again, that's very real. I mean, the people who are the losers in this, they're going to lose, and they're not going to be part of it unless you figure out a way to help them win. So I think we have some pretty significant issues to get through on exactly how we're going to price carbon. The other question is that even if we do price carbon, at some point you run into a brick wall, which is you can't get there from here. You can't reduce emissions by 80%. And, frankly, down to zero. You can't do it with the current technologies. I mean, the world is burning, between 80 and 90% of all the energy consumed in the world is a fossil fuel of some kind. That's a lot of replacement to do. And we're talking about not very long. You can't get there from here. So while I think a carbon tax is a very important mechanism, we've got another question to answer, which is what are we going to do instead? And that's a tough question. And I wouldn't, even though the carbon tax is important, some kind of price on carbon, I wouldn't want to lose sight of fact what the real issue here, which is how do we build the global economy on something other than fossil fuels? Because we don't have an answer to that yet. So that's an interesting question to me. And your question is, what are the barriers? Like, why can't we get there from here?
Exactly. Coordination barriers, political barriers, China, coal, who's going to make money on it?
Ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, to some extent we've all said that one of the problems is that it's not that a country like China doesn't understand what climate change means. I love the way you said it, Nick. It's that you're asking them to make trade-offs between today and 30 years from now. If they lower their growth rates by tackling this problem now, they're going to have rioting in the streets. Your government will fall today or it'll fall 30 years from now. You're always going to choose 30 years from now and hope that something happens in the intervening time to make it easier and to help. So, I mean, I think the fundamental barrier is that you're talking about serious trade-offs, and you're talking about undermining the entire foundation of the global economy. It's just, it's not quite, there are certainly all kinds of other barriers, public opinion and political barriers, and all those things are real, but when the ultimate barrier is that you can't get there from here, that there really are some hard decisions to be made, and that we don't have the way out of the dilemma that we're in. I mean, I think that's the barrier that you can't get over, ultimately. But
Nick, any final thoughts?
I mean, one thing I wanted to say from the previous conversation, which comes back to both Clionadh and Sharon's points. Again, India, people forget about India. It's a fascinating country. My wife's Indian, and she runs an NGO there, so that's why I talk about it. One of the most interesting adaptation debates is going on in India between the ministry involved, which runs flood defence, that wants all the adaptation money to go into flood defence, big projects, and the Minister for the Panchayat Raj, which is this kind of local democracy at the village level, 250,000 villages, I think, who wants to, and there's India's most kind of famous scientist trying to promote the idea of a climate adaptation leader in each village, which would deal with climate security. It's precisely, it's not, you can't separate development and resources and security. It's just there's a threshold issue. So, and there's a huge fight between those two about what does it mean to do adaptation in a country like India, and that's all about power. That is all about power. And the indigenous peoples groups in India are saying to Indian government, who has voted against giving them a seat at the table, indigenous groups generally globally, at Copenhagen. But guess who's in the marginal areas in India? The tribals. Guess who gets the bad end of the stick in power relations on resource? The tribals. This is politics coming out now. This is conflict on a political level. But you only have to look at India and look at the Naxalites to realise that if you don't resolve this thing, it'll find an ideology and come back at you pretty soon. And I think it's again, people talk about this as very abstract. If you look around the world, outside the developed world, you see these stresses bubbling through as real politics now. And hopefully, to be honest, the Maldives and the Bangladeshis getting on the Indians' case, the Africans getting on the Chinese case, will be some of the ways we get the political conditions to come around. Because in the end, it's political conditions to try and reach this goal is critical. And that's why we keep on banging on about, to the reason you want to try, the main thing is motivation. What's going to happen if you don't? And if people keep on talking about it as if it's going to be a moderate change, things will kind of go along a bit worse, and those Africans will have a hard time, but it won't be us. We won't do anything. Because climate change might be cheap to solve. At $120 a barrel, it's free. Completely and utterly free. Any analysis you look at. And $120 a barrel is median forecast 2015. But it's not easy, because it involves shifting the whole energy system, $30 trillion worth of investment, 2030, from high carbon, people who own high carbon assets, to low carbon. The London Stock Exchange has enough carbon listed on it to take us to 750 parts per million in the atmosphere instead of 450, which is the limit. Listed as assets, as if they can be burnt on the stock exchange. Those are some of the interests we're talking about. And it's not, they're not going to just go away or say it's going to be easy or not put up problems in the Senate or in Europe, in Poland. So, until we, one, realise what we're trying to stop, and two, realise you have to mobilise, it's a political decision to actually decide to do it. We won't get there. And then, to be honest, cap and trade versus tax becomes a bit of a technical segue. In Europe, to be honest, we're now moving towards regulation. If you talk to anybody who's serious on energy policy in Europe, we're saying, to be honest, it's too quick. We're trying to drive the system too quick to use economic instruments. We're going to have to be much more directive. And so we've now, UK, 43% of electricity will come from renewables. It's a target. Bang, build it. It's not a choice. So it's efficient. We'll do it efficiently, but we have to, if you want to get security, you want to get something by some time. And actually leaving it to the market to decide when these things happen by setting taxes or trading, people are starting to think not really reliable, lots of problems could go into. So again, I think the debate is going to move. If we're serious, the debate will move to how quickly can I build this stuff and avoid building the wrong stuff. And perhaps the economic stimulus packages will be the beginning of that, because it is about spending all our money for the next 10 years.
And on the worst case scenario, I suppose Africa is the worst case scenario because it's expected to have some of the more egregious changes, and of course, it's there's social instability is huge. But for that, it's very important to actually look at the past. I know that there's been some discussion about whether or not it's useful, and I think it is, because the political topography in African states is going to, I would say, define how different groups make out with this with climate changes, and without actually acknowledging that that is probably the most important vulnerability as opposed to physical, I think that we will be focusing on the wrong thing, I suppose, in the end, and probably over-predict conflict in certain areas and not understand why it's erupting in others.
Yes, well, certainly a theme that remember the politics, and you can't stop at the scientific edge, so to speak. Clionadh, Nick, and Sharon, thank you very much. Really rich discussion. We bit off a real small bite today with this kind of massive topic, and I think, but in some ways, a good reality check for what we're up against as we kind of many in this town come down off a high about change and start facing the reality of what change may be, or may difficulty in reaching it in this realm, and then also try to make a transition to understanding how these worlds that have typically been quite apart, the environmental and climate worlds and the security worlds, come together and have actually some real interdependencies, but also, as we've heard both in the discussion of the game and some of the risk analysis sense, and a deeper understanding of conflict, that there are some real terrific tools that can actually help us a lot, and we benefit from getting on about the difficulty of learning each other's languages and finding ways to build break down barriers between our various bureaucracies and perspectives. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and look to our website and such for more resources on this, and hopefully more discussions in this room with folks like this who are really looking at these issues closely. So thank you all very much.